Welcome to Talaterra, a podcast about freelance educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. Who are these educators? What do they do? Join me, and let's find out together. This is your host, Tanya Marion. Today, my guest is Rebecca Rolnick. Rebecca is a naturalist, writer, and educator. She is the founder of Forest School to You, where she leads in-person and online programs for both K-12 students and adults. Rebecca also leads conversations about neurodiversity in environmental education. I spoke to Rebecca after attending a discussion she led during the annual conference of the North American Association for Environmental Education in the fall of 2021. What is neurodiversity? Why is Rebecca leading panel discussions and inviting environmental educators to conversations about this topic? Let's find out. Rebecca, thank you so much for stopping by the show today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation about neurodiversity in environmental education. The panel discussion that you led at the recent conference of for the North American Association for Environmental Education really caught my interest. And so I'm very excited to be able to have this discussion with you here for this audience of independent professionals who work through communities. May I ask you to introduce yourself to listeners, please?
Sure. So I'm Rebecca. I'm a naturalist and environmental educator. My overarching mission is to conserve biodiversity and help connect people to nature.
You are an independent environmental educator. You are the founder of Forest School to You. Can you tell us how you came to found this after-school program?
Sure. So it's not exactly an after-school program. And so there was never really an exact moment where I decided to do this and to be an independent environmental educator. But basically, it started because my original dream was to be a field biologist. I studied conservation biology in college at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and I really wanted to be either like an ornithologist, or I used to joke I wanted to be one of those people who lives in a hut and stares at animals. And so after a few seasons of doing field seasons and doing field work, I figured out that it wasn't exactly right for me. I really struggled with it a lot because it's very physically intense and I have some health issues, but also because I realized that doing the same thing every day wasn't always interesting to me. When you're doing data collection, it's about a very specific set of things that you're looking for, and I felt like I would lose context of the rest of the entire ecosystem, which I always wanted to be learning more and more about. So on the one hand, it was pretty hard to kind of come to terms with the fact that it was so difficult for me. But on the other hand, I realized that I really love to learn new things all the time and then get to share that with people. And so that's how I started getting really more into environmental education. So I started volunteering in my hometown with the Young Naturalist program, which is run by the Central New York chapter of the Isaac Walton League. And I eventually became the leader of that program. During COVID, it's run through the local libraries. Usually we would have in-person programs at the libraries, but when COVID hit, we started doing them online, and I was designing and teaching a new program every week for the local kids of my area on the internet and over Zoom. in October of last year, I was recognized as Volunteer of the Month in my town for that work. And so also during COVID, I was looking for work. I was looking for a job, and I had the idea that maybe I could be a tutor for the kids who have missed so much school and might need some help catching up. But then it occurred to me that I was already doing all of this environmental education work as a volunteer, that instead of being a regular tutor, maybe I could do that and offer science and nature programs and do it in a way that I felt comfortable, because it was hard for me to find a job during COVID that I could feel safe doing. And so that's how Forest School to You was born. And it's based on the idea of forest school programs and nature programs, but instead of people coming to me, I could go to people, to families, or to homeschool pods and groups like that. So it's still evolving somewhat, and I'm sure will continue to evolve. My work has a focus on helping people to develop a deeper sense of place and belonging, to find a sense of curiosity and wonder in the world around them, to develop critical thinking skills, and to be able to think like a scientist, but also to have a deeper emotional connection to nature and a better connection to yourself, because we are a part of nature. And so most recently, I taught a class called Nature Journaling for Ecological Re-STORY-ation. And so this is inspired by the quote from the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which says that it's not just the land that's broken, but our relationship to the land. And the land cannot heal until we start to hear its stories. And it's about how people can use nature journaling as a tool for this idea of re-story-ation, to develop to restore their connection to the land and learn how to be in a reciprocal relationship with nature.
Mm-hmm. I see that you focus on K-12 is your primary focus age group, or you also work with adults as well?
I also work with adults. So the Forest School to You programs are more of the younger kids. I haven't been focused on that as much recently, just because I've been a little bit more cautious because of COVID. I haven't been doing as much of the in-person programs. My Re-STORY-ation class has been for adults, and I think they have really enjoyed the class a lot, and some of them have said that it's helped them to notice so much more than they noticed before around them, and to it's kind of like this whole world opens up when you start noticing all of the life and all of the wonders that are around us all the time, but we don't always notice them. And I think nature journaling is often thought of as kind of an art project. You know, you want the pages to look the right way, you want it to be something that you could show other people. But what I would like people to learn from my various classes is that it's about the process. It's not about the product. My nature journal pages are messy, and that's okay. It's about using it as a tool to learn and to have a deeper connection with nature.
So your audience is responding to the writing exercises, they're responding to the observation exercises that you lead them through, and starting a sketchbook or a journal. And I think that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, so when you said that some people might find writing easier or drawing easier, it really depends on the person. Everybody has their comfort zone, and everybody has something that's their growth edge. So I think it's really important to encourage people to start out with whichever area they feel most comfortable with, but also encourage people to try out different ways too. So, for example, I tend to focus on words. For me, that's easier to just get my thoughts down, and it doesn't really matter like what the pictures look like. Sometimes I put in doodles or sketches. But for some people, words are really hard, and pictures can be a great way for them to learn. So, for example, this actually ties in with the whole idea of neurodiversity because I've learned so much about nature journaling from John Muir Laws, the author, scientist, and artist who really focuses on nature journaling, and the community that he's really developed, especially during COVID online. And I know that his story, he found that school and everything growing up was very difficult for him and very stressful because he is dyslexic. And so for him, having a sketchbook and getting to go draw and spend time in nature after school was something that had a really big impact on him. So it really just depends on the person. And I think that's one of the great things about nature journaling, among other forms of nature connection, is that it really allows you to do things in your own way and to explore your own gifts and and find your strengths, especially if it's something that might be underappreciated. And so I do have some classes for kids, some classes for adults. I've also taught on OutSchool a little bit for kids, and I was also recently hired to lead Tinkergarten programs. So that's another thing that I'll be offering. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tinkergarten.
No, what is Tinkergarten?
So Tinkergarten is a program that's focused on outdoor play experiences in nature and having kids grow and learn through play and with their families. So it's a program that's run all over the country. They hire people to lead programs in your local area. And so I'm really excited to start being able to offer this to my local community in addition to the other things that I've been doing. So I have some programs that are for kids, some programs that are for adults. The free nature journal programs that I've been leading have a variety of ages come to them. And so really in creating a business or an offering, there's the whole idea that, you're supposed to really narrow down and find your niche and to focus on a specific age group. And I think I'm doing that with the specific different things that I'm doing, but really my vision is that I want to offer things to multiple age groups because I want to really create an intergenerational community where we can all support each other and learn together. Because I think one of the biggest problems is this disconnection between generations. In conservation, there's this idea of shifting baseline syndrome, which is basically means that our idea of what's normal changes with each generation. So that the environment might have become more and more degraded, but we don't realize it because that's what we see as normal. So we're basically losing biodiversity and losing habitats right under our noses. And so I think being able to restore connection between generations is something that I see as very important for the future of conservation.
Absolutely. Your program brings different generations together. And I love what you said about how you are setting things up so that people can explore their own strengths and interests. And you also mentioned neurodiversity. So let's talk about neurodiversity in the field. So at this year's conference for the North American Association for Environmental Education, I saw the conversation that you led about supporting neurodivergent students and educators in the field. Let's begin by discussing what neurodiversity is. So, what is neurodiversity?
So, neurodiversity refers to this idea that different people's brains are wired in different ways. So, for example, some types of neurodiversity include dyslexia, ADHD, autism spectrum, just to name a couple. There are many, many others. And the idea of calling it neurodiversity is the idea that these things are not inherently always disabilities, but just different ways of thinking and experiencing the world. There's a quote that Harvey Bloom wrote in The Atlantic in 1998 that says that neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment?
What prompted you to gather the panelists and to have this conversation at this year's conference?
Yeah, so I started to learn and think very deeply about these topics about a year ago because I figured out that I think that I'm neurodiverse. And I won't spend time going into detail about that here and why I think that, but it was a really big deal for me because it was kind of this light bulb moment, where it's like, oh my gosh, this makes my whole life make sense. I'd always known a little bit about these things before that, but there's a lot of a sense of shame around these topics that I think prevents people from talking about it more, and that can prevent people from discovering who they are. And what I learned is that about 10% of all people are dyslexic. I don't remember the percentages for autism spectrum or ADHD, but if you added up all of those, that's a really large percentage of all humans who are some kind of neurodiverse. And what really hit me really deeply in that way is there are all of these people who have been taught that there's something wrong with them. And I think that's really sad. And I think that's a problem because, everybody faces different challenges than other people. And some people need more support than other people. But that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. And that everybody has something important to offer. And so that's why I wanted to have that conversation in the panel discussion. And the other thing that I want to really emphasize is that I'm not an expert in these topics. It's just something that I developed an interest in and that I think that more people need to talk about. And so that's why, instead of just doing a presentation, that's why I did it as a panel discussion. So I invited other neurodiverse educators, or one was an educator who works with neurodivergent kids, and so that they could all share their experiences too.
Yes, it was a really fascinating conversation. You wanted to have these conversations because you noticed something that wasn't happening. What isn't happening? What do you feel needs to happen in the field? Why did you feel it was important to have this conversation with environmental educators specifically at this time?
Well, I think because as educators, we work with all different kinds of people. And so I think it's really important to be aware of these things because with the sizable percentage of people who are in the neurodiverse population, we're all interacting with neurodivergent people, whether you know it or not. And especially as educators, I think it's really important to at least be aware of that possibility so that we can support our students in the best ways that we can. And I also think that there are some interesting possibilities that environmental education might be uniquely situated to benefit neurodiverse people. So, for example, when I was learning about dyslexia and the type of learning environments that are best for dyslexic students, that's small groups, personalized attention, and multisensory experiences. And that's exactly the kind of environment in a forest school. I think there's a lot of overlap for kids who maybe have a challenge in a traditional classroom setting, that outdoor education or learning in nature can provide a lot of benefits for kids who are neurodiverse in a variety of ways. But I also think that the environment can benefit from this too. Like, yes, it's about inclusion and it's about, compassion for different kinds of people, and it's about accessibility. But at the same time, I think that the earth needs all of us right now to be at our full potential and to be able to find our unique gifts and to share them in the world. Whatever support we need to make that happen.
I love the initiative that you've taken around this subject, that you started conversations, a year ago, right? As I understand it, at the 2020 NAAE conference. This year you turned it around and made it into a panel discussion and to have even more conversation about it. And I just love how you are building the conversations that you are creating.
Yeah, and this is just the beginning of a conversation, and I'm still learning too.
Mm-hmm. From what you've learned over the past year with your conversations with colleagues and with classroom educators and others, what have you changed about how you lead your programs based on what you've learned in your conversations over the past year?
I would say the main thing is that neurodivergent people are all really different, and there are lots of kinds of neurodiversity that I haven't even mentioned here. So it's really hard for me to say, like, oh, do this, this, and this to make all of your programs more accessible, because people have very different kinds of needs. So for me, I think it's really more the mindset of how I approach things. So I think one of the first most important things is don't make assumptions, because it's often not something that's visible. You can't tell just by looking at somebody if they're neurodivergent or if they're neurotypical. And the person you're with, they might not even know themselves that they're neurodivergent. And start with the premise that every single person has something to offer, and to meet people where they are in that moment, and they'll take away from that experience whatever it is that they need most at the time, and that's where they are in their learning journey. So I know often for environmental education, there's this idea of, this is your objective, this is the theme you wrote for the program, and your goal is to have this percentage of students, be able to understand the theme by the end of the program. But one thing that I think is we can think about how we evaluate programs and our own goals. And I think to see our programs as more of a co-creation of we're learning together, and students might come away from that experience with their own meaning that they've created, something that they've learned that might not be something that we planned, but something that supports them in their learning for what they needed. My work these days has been really inspired by the ideas of nature connection, and I really use the book Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature from the Wilderness Awareness School. And they talk about, as the way that they evaluate their programs, they use these criteria that they've developed called the indicators of awareness. And so this doesn't have to replace more traditional types of evaluation, but they use these different, what they call indicators of awareness, to try to assess how the student is doing in the program. So these indicators of awareness are common sense, aliveness and agility, inquisitive focus, caring and tending, service to the community, awe and reverence, self-sufficiency, and the quiet mind. So if we can help people in our programs, whether they're kids or adults, to achieve these states, then they can do anything. And then they'll be motivated to learn at their own pace in their own way, and to be able to find their strengths and to give back in some way. And so I do have a couple other ideas for making things more accessible. So I already mentioned having information accessible in multiple ways and having people be able to show their learning in multiple ways. Another thing is to have sensory-friendly environments, particularly for people who might be on the autism spectrum. And I think to have ways to let people know what they need, to have avenues of communication open for that, to have it clear. Because people coming, I think ideally, if you can know ahead of time if somebody in your program is neurodivergent or what kind of support they might need, that's good, but you don't always know. But I think that just talking about these things and creating an environment where it's okay for people to talk about it, where they're not afraid of that they're going to be shamed or looked down on if they talk about it. I think even just being more vocal, continuing these conversations, and showing that you're thinking about neurodiversity and trying to learn more about it and how to make things better. We're all learning here, and you never know who around you might be impacted by that in a positive way. That somebody might be more encouraged to be open about who they are and to explore what they need, even if they're just trying to figure it out for themselves, like that they think they might be neurodivergent. And the other big point that I want to make is that it's not just kids. I think this conversation could easily turn into, how do educators support neurodivergent students that they have? And that's a big part of it. But adults are still neurodivergent when they grow up. So, for example, coworkers or the parents, and again, they might not even be aware of it themselves because a lot of people have been misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed, or they might be trying to hide it because of the stigma that they've experienced. So it's about supporting students, but it's also about supporting the educators ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. And the adult audiences, the adult learners.
And the adult audiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you go over the indicators again from that book? Can you just recite them real quick again?
Yeah. So again, this is from Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature, which was produced by the Wilderness Awareness School. And it's become a big part of what I use to develop my programs because it is based on, just a quick aside, it's based on this idea of nature connection. So there's education modeling, which is, trying to teach people certain information. And then there's recreation modeling, which is, hiking, kayaking, camping, all of those sorts of things and outdoor experiences. But there's a third part that is really missing in our culture, to the point that most people don't even realize that it's missing, which is connection. And it's not to say that education isn't important or to say that recreation isn't important, but all three of these systems can work together. And it's really about creating that sense of belonging and sense of connection. And the idea is, if you can get people connected to nature on it's really more of like a biological, ergonomic level, then they'll care about nature automatically. It's like you don't have to convince people about what to think, because if you are connected to nature, then you just automatically want to take care of it.
Yeah. And then the indicators in that book again that you shared earlier, what are the indicators that the educators use to evaluate their programs?
Yeah, so in this, and again, this doesn't have to replace other forms of assessment or valuation, but these ones are common sense, aliveness and agility, inquisitive focus, caring and tending, service to the community, awe and reverence, self-sufficiency, and quiet mind.
Thank you for reviewing them again. I asked you to do that because what really jumped out to me the first time you went through the list, and what definitely came through this time, was that these are all observable and immediately observable actions, traits, behaviors. And, given the way that environmental educators work through their communities, sometimes we don't have a lot of time to spend with them. Sometimes it's a 1 week type camp situation. Sometimes it is a tabletop activity at a STEM festival or a science festival or something. I think those are really helpful. It's I think motivate educators to create help them think through a more thoughtful approach to their programming and to their engagement. Have you found that to be the case for yourself?
Yeah, I think it helps me just to have a bigger picture of what is the importance of this program. Maybe there's something specific that I want to teach and I want them to learn this information. But I think it's also important to remember what's the impact of this on their life and how are we helping them to be the best person that they can be, and to really center that.
What can listeners do in their program to enhance their programming? What's that first tiny step that they can do?
I guess the main first thing that is really just emphasizing this idea that everybody learns in their own way, everybody processes information in their own way, and we're all learning together. So it's hard for me to give specific things, again, because neurodiverse people are so different, and need very different kinds of support. But I think really just that approach and that mindset is the most important first thing. And I'm still learning too. If any of the listeners have other thoughts or ideas, I'd love to hear what they think too.
That's great insight. Open your minds to all the possibilities there and all of the people who you might encounter in your programs. What resources, websites, books, other podcasts, other things that you have seen that have been very helpful to you? We'll include these things in the show notes as well so that listeners can go there. It's always accessible to the listeners.
Yeah, I definitely have some resources to share because after I started figuring out about myself, I did a very deep dive into these topics, got really curious about learning more for the next few months after that. But if you want to learn more about neurodiversity, I think learning more about neurodiversity from the perspective of neurodiverse people is very important. Listening to them talk about their own stories, what it's actually like for them, and the impact that it has on their lives, looking for things like YouTube channels from neurodiverse people where they talk about all of their experiences, or books by neurodivergent people. One specific book that I'd really like to recommend is called The Dyslexia Empowerment Plan by Ben Foss, and it really focuses on how do you integrate it into your identity? How do you help a child or a student to know what their strengths are and to be proud of their strengths, even though they struggle with some things that most people don't? And how do you understand how to advocate for yourself and the Americans with Disabilities Act and all of that? And so I think I'd highly recommend that book to learn more about dyslexia, but also I think it's a really great resource for any kind of disability. It can also be useful to dig into more formal sources a little bit and open up Google Scholar and look at some scientific journals. Of course, you do need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes people doing the research, if they're neurotypical, they might start out with assumptions that aren't entirely accurate because they're observing people from the outside, and that might not be accurate to what it's actually like to be neurodivergent. Sometimes research can be based on those kind of assumptions, but I think you're seeing more and more these days improvements in research, and sometimes even research on neurodiversity that's done by neurodivergent people.
So what's an example of an assumption that listeners might come across in something they read or hear?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is stereotypes about neurodiversity, and particularly with autism spectrum. If you try to search it on the internet, a lot of materials come up, and this is true for some other types of neurodiversity too, but a lot of the resources focus on that trait in children. It's often described, they can often be described as a disorder or a developmental disorder. And I think a lot of these things have stereotypes of, a person, for example, a person who's on the autism spectrum is a young white boy who is obsessed with trains. Like those kinds of stereotypes. But the diagnostic criteria was written based on a very specific group of people, which that was kind of where the stereotype comes from, because the diagnostic criteria were written based on young white boys who had a certain type of the traits, but which has led to a lot of other people to not get diagnosed, even though they might fit the criteria, or they just have those traits, but not in that exact specific type of way. So one thing that I would like to be really clear about is this idea of neurodiversity and these different things. Is it a disability? Is it not? Is it a disorder? And all of the different ways that it gets represented. And I saw this word neurodiversity describing that way is trying to make the point is that it's not a disorder. It's not something that has to be fixed. It's just something that's a part of who you are and the way that your brain is wired. But I want to be really clear about the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a disability. And then there's also this idea, is it inherently a disability? Or there's this idea of the social model of disability, which is to say that, there's nothing inherently wrong with you. It's just the way our society's set up is not conducive to people with this kind of brain. So, like, I have a lot of sensory sensitivities. The modern world is not really set up for that. It's very noisy and confusing sometimes. For example, there are these two different kinds of narratives, like, oh, it's a disability. No, it's a superpower. And, really it's somewhere in the middle. I think it's okay to say, this is kind of, I just want to kind of bring in this nuance, is that it's okay to say that, yes, like, there's nothing wrong with you. You're fine the way you are, and it's not a disorder per se. But to also say that, different types of neurodiversity, that still is a disability. You're still protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can still get accommodations that you need and get support. But that's not to say that there's something wrong with you. I think both of these ideas can coexist. And another thing is that this idea of, high functioning or low functioning, and trying to move past that binary. I think a lot of people focus on, what you might think of as a low functioning person, but both of those terms are very problematic. Because on the one hand, if you're describing somebody as low functioning, then you're completely discounting all of the things that they can do. They'd maybe just need some higher levels of support, but you're not seeing them for everything that they are. On the other hand, if somebody is described as high functioning, then you're minimizing the support that maybe they do need. And sometimes if people are neurodivergent in general, again, you can't tell all the time just by seeing them. You might think, oh, how could you be neurodivergent? Like, you seem completely normal, like you seem fine. But you can't always tell that they might actually be struggling on the inside.
Mm-hmm. You really are reliant on the individual themselves to share that amount, that or not, because they certainly don't need to share that about themselves. Yeah, exactly.
And so part of it is to be, as educators, to have to be aware of other people and what they might need, to try to find out about people you're working with. But the other thing that's really important, either for yourself or to teach other people, how to advocate for yourself and how to ask for what you need, how to ask for help, whatever that is, and to know that you're not a burden and it's okay to ask for help. And I think this can especially be difficult in a job situation, to try to get accommodations if you are neurodivergent, or if you have a disability, or if you have a chronic illness like I do. It can be very difficult to advocate for yourself and to get accommodations, but it's a very important skill to be able to learn.
To learn more about Rebecca, Forced School to You, and neurodiversity, visit the show notes. Rebecca has prepared a long list of resources for you if you'd like to learn more about this topic. Below Rebecca's list, you'll find 3 additional items in the show notes. These are items that I've placed that complement some of the content mentioned during our conversation. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tanya Marion.